And Issues, a monthly business forum bringing timely economic discussion to the region for 35 years. Presented by the Portland Community Chamber of Commerce. Presenting sponsors, Bank of America and Martins Point Healthcare. Cooperating sponsors, First Light, WEX, and Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Community Corner sponsor, Goral Palmer. Reception sponsors, Clark Insurance, KeyBank, and Veril. Tomorrow's Leaders and Entrepreneurs sponsors, Springborn Staffing Center and AAA Northern New England. Media partners, News Radio WGAN, The Forecaster, WMTW News 8, Mainebiz, with production support provided by Headlight. Special community partners, Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, Spectrum Healthcare Partners, the University of Southern Maine, and Southern Maine Community College. And now, please welcome Portland Community Chamber President, Jim Cohen.
Good morning and welcome to Virtual Eggs and Issues, the monthly business breakfast of the Portland Community Chamber of Commerce. This is our first Eggs and Issues of the season, and we are thrilled to be joined shortly by our U.S. Senator Angus King, someone my family and I have been privileged to know personally, along with his wife Mary, for decades, and who continues to do a great job representing the people of Maine. My name is Jim Cohen, coming to you live from my living room studio located in the North Deering neighborhood of Portland, Maine. I'm a partner with the Veril law firm, and I'm honored to serve as the volunteer president of the Portland Community Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors. I could not be prouder of the Portland Community Chamber of Commerce and our umbrella organization, the Portland Regional Chamber of Commerce. Over the last 6 months of pandemic and racial unrest, the Portland Chamber and its terrific staff, under the leadership of CEO Quincy Hensel, has stepped up in so many ways, all while working part-time under a work-share program due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Early in the pandemic, the Chamber took a leadership role in helping businesses get back to work through the Pay It Forward campaign. And as the economy reopened and we struggled to deal with conflicts over the safety of workers and customers, the Chamber again stepped forward in a leadership role with the Let's Be Kind campaign. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, I'm proud of the racial and gender diversity of our board, and as the killing of George Floyd in the spring brought to the surface long-standing issues of racial injustice, I am proud of how the Chamber helped convene hundreds of businesses, large and small, in the Standing in Solidarity Against Racial and Social Injustice campaign. That effort continues with education about implicit bias and best practices for promoting racial and social equality. Thank you, Portland Chamber of Commerce. I also want to thank all of you once again for joining us safely this season for Eggs and Issues. For years at Eggs and Issues, we've enjoyed each other's company, made meaningful connections, and shared a hearty breakfast at the Holiday Inn by the Bay in downtown Portland. We hope to return to those days in the coming future for many reasons. However, in the interim, we appreciate the opportunity to provide our members with virtual online programming so that you can remain connected to the community and stay up to date on all the current issues of today. It turns out we have an audience of at least 650 registrants this morning, and an international audience, as my sister, who is in England, says she'll be tuning in as well. One of the benefits of the virtual Eggs and Issues platform. Speaking of which, you may be aware that we have an election coming up on November 3rd. Who knew? For Portland voters, it will be one of the busiest ballots we have seen in a while, where voters will be faced with 6 referendum questions. The Portland Chamber has had a chance to survey its members about those questions, and based on your input, we made the decision to get engaged in and oppose 3 of the 6 referendum questions. First, an initiative that would impose rent control on residential housing, which Portland voters rejected several years ago. Second, another initiative previously defeated by voters that would increase the minimum wage in Portland to $15 an hour, but in a new twist, the proposal would increase the wage to $22.50 once fully implemented during declared states of emergency, an amount that poses a grave threat to the survival of many of our small local businesses. And finally, an initiative to establish a Green New Deal, which is a good marketing slogan for a 17-page proposal with new building and labor requirements that would raise the cost or deter many affordable housing and school projects in Portland. You will be hearing much more from the Chamber on all 3 of these issues, and we have bookmarked our October Eggs and Issues program to discuss each of these in more detail and make sure our membership is well informed. Before we begin today's presentation, I do want to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors of Eggs and Issues who make this event possible, whether in person or virtual. First and foremost, our presenting sponsors, Bank of America and Martins Point Healthcare. I also want to thank our other generous sponsors, First Light, WEX, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, Clark Insurance, Key Bank, Verrill, Goral Palmer, AAA Northern New England, and Springborn Staffing. Also, a special thank you to our media sponsors, The Forecaster, WGAN, WMTW, Maine CW, and Mainebiz. And a thank you to our FMI sponsor, the Portland Public Library. We miss our friends at Headlight Audiovisual, and we hope to be back in person soon and working with them once again. And a very special thank you to our special community partners who support all of our Chamber initiatives: Anthem, Spectrum Healthcare Partners, University of Southern Maine, Southern Maine Community College, and MEMIC. A virtual round of applause for all of our amazing sponsors. Now on to today's topic, a conversation with Senator Angus King, featuring Maine's independent Senator Angus King. After Senator King's presentation concludes, we'll move into a brief Q&A session. As with prior virtual Eggs and Issues, we encourage the audience to participate in today's discussion by submitting your questions or comments through the chat function on your YouTube screen. To do so, you will first need to log into your Google or YouTube account. With that, we would like to start the program. My friend, Senator Angus King Jr., is in his 2nd term as US Senator for the great state of Maine, and we were privileged to have Senator King serve as Governor of Maine for 2 terms from 1994 to 2002. Senator King is an independent who caucuses with the Democrats in the Senate, and as a true Mainer, he is also an avid skier, motorcycle rider, and RV trekker. We are thrilled to welcome Senator Angus King to Eggs and Issues this morning. Welcome, Angus.
Well, it's great to be with all of you this morning and to have some time to spend. I'm going to move my camera out a little bit. I don't want to look like Oz on your screen. Just to show you a little bit about what Maine is all about. Jim mentioned decades. I've known Jim's family for 48 years, Jim. I just made the calculation. I don't think you weren't a member of Verrill at that point, I don't think. But it's really fun to be with you all this morning. And I really miss being in that big hall and at the Holiday Inn by the Bay and getting a chance to chat with so many people. And, you know, we're doing it the best we can. And if you stop and think about it, how much worse this terrible pandemic would be if we didn't have these kinds of technologies, if people, there are many people who can work from home, and it would just be twice as bad, 3 times as bad in terms of its economic impact if we didn't have this technology. So I'm glad to be able to join you. I'm going to run through this morning, and people tease me about this. I like to organize speeches sometimes by giving you a list of 10. It's an easy way to think about things. So I'm going to give you 10 observations that I have about the US Senate after having been here for a while and sort of watching it at work. Number 1 is it's worse than it looks. And in that, I mean, it's just very partisan. It's institutionally partisan, and it really impedes our ability to get things done. And you've seen that. You've seen the gridlock and the back and forth, and how hard it is to try to reach some kind of consensus, or even to get to the point of debating some kind of consensus. So that's number one. Number two is the opposite. In many ways, it's better than it looks. It's institutionally partisan, but not personally partisan. There are many friendships and relationships across the aisle. And one way to sort of test me on this is to watch a Senate vote on C-SPAN 2. If you're bored, or if you're, suffering from insomnia. And the way the Senate votes is not like in the movies where everybody sits in their chairs and says yay or nay. They call a roll, the bells go off, there's a vote, you get an email, and senators come into the chamber from wherever they are. And these days, quite often, they're coming from home, where they're working from home. And then there's a lot of milling around. There's not as much now because of the COVID and everybody has a mask on. But typically, there's a lot of milling around, and it's generally bipartisan. People are talking to one another. You'll see Dick Durbin talking to John Cornyn or Richard Burr or somebody. So I tell people it's like the dump on Saturday morning. There's a lot of interplay. So in that sense, it's not as bad as it looks. We don't hate each other, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The media uses words like toxic atmosphere. There is tension and there is partisanship, but it doesn't go to the personal. Number three is that the majority leader has unbelievable power. I worked at the Senate 45 years ago now, and the majority leader at that time sort of kept the schedule moving and was a facilitator of debate and discussion. The real power in those days in the Senate was in the committees and the committee chairs. Today, power has sort of devolved or evolved to the majority leader in an unbelievable way. The majority leader has complete control over what comes to the Senate floor. The majority leader, has dictatorial control that would make Julius Caesar blush. If a bill comes from the House, and in fact, the House this year has passed something like 400 bills, all of which are sitting on his desk, which he won't bring to the Senate floor. So there's no opportunity for debate. There's no opportunity to even discuss those bills. On the other hand, he can bring a bill up that he wrote, that was written in his office, never went through committee, never had any debate in committee or a committee vote. That can come to the floor. And there's a peculiar rule called filling the tree, where the majority leader can use a procedural technique whereby there are no amendments, or maybe just a few amendments. So there's no opportunity to have amendments to bills. Now, this isn't a direct criticism of Mitch McConnell, because Harry Reid, when he was majority leader, had and used similar powers, but each time it seems to get worse. And Mitch has taken it to a new level of really total control. So that's one of the things that surprised me about the Senate. And it's something that I think we really need to do something about. I'm on the Rules Committee. I'm going to bring up a proposal in the new Congress that if a bill gets through a committee with a bipartisan, some kind of supermajority, I don't specify yet, I haven't thought it through to that point, but if a bill gets through a committee with a bipartisan majority, it should have an automatic opportunity to come to the floor. And there should be some ability to provide amendments, maybe a limited number. But right now, that just isn't the case. Number four, one of the problems with the Senate is a lack of deep and serious relationships. And believe it or not, that reflects a lot as something as mundane as the schedule. Here's the typical Senate schedule. The first vote of the week is late Monday afternoon. The last vote of the week is early Thursday afternoon. So what happens? Everybody goes home Thursday afternoon and comes back Monday afternoon. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody. Senators from Ohio, from Illinois, from Oregon, Brian Schatz, my friend from Hawaii, at least before COVID, goes home every weekend. And if you think about that, that severely diminishes the ability to develop relationships. When I worked here 45 years ago, everybody lived in Washington. Their kids went to school here. Their families were here. They went home occasionally, once a month, once every 6 weeks. But most of their lives were here, and they got to know one another. And they carpooled together, or they went to kids' ball games together. There were relationships built, and it's very hard if you think about it. Imagine trying to negotiate an important deal without any kind of relationship or development of trust between you and the other person. That's really one of the serious problems of this place, is the lack of relationships. You all have probably heard about my little rib dinners. I'm in my house here. Mary and I have a house here about 8 blocks from the Capitol. Periodically, not during COVID, our last one was in March, but periodically, once every month or 6 weeks, my office would call around to the Senate offices, assemble just 4 or 5, always bipartisan. I'd stop at Kenny's Smokehouse, by the way, where I got pick up dinner Saturday night, and pick up ribs, beans, and coleslaw. And we just have a time to be together, to meet each other. And I think at the time we sort of broke off in March, I think I'd had about 60, between 55 and 65 of the 100 senators, everybody from Mitch McConnell and Ted Cruz to Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren. I mean, that's a pretty broad spectrum. And it was always beneficial to try to build those relationships. But believe it or not, my little rib dinners are about it for bipartisan social events. The only other one is the prayer breakfast on Wednesday morning, where we get together and have some fellowship and discussion. But by and large, the place is just locked into this this partisan divide. The Republicans have an official party lunch every day that we're here, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. The Democrats have one Tuesday and Thursday. They sort of go nuts and say you're on your own on Wednesday. But the point is, there's very little in the way of interplay between individuals, which I think is one of the things that impairs our ability to get things done. Number 5, and we're halfway through now, so that's a nice way of about how this speech is organized. Number 5, and I'm really serious about this, Congress is committing slow motion institutional suicide. It's basically giving away its powers. And it's not what the framers intended. It's not what the framers had in mind. It's not the way our government is supposed to work. For example, the war power. The Constitution is very clear. They divided responsibility between the Congress and the president with regard to war. And if you go back to the debates at the convention in August of 1787, they didn't want the president to have the power to take the country to war. They thought that should be a congressional decision. So it's specifically in the Constitution that Congress has the power to declare war. It hasn't done so since 1942. And it's not that the president has usurped that power, any president. It's that Congress has effectively given it away. Another example is foreign trade. Trade is, again, explicitly in the power of Congress. Congress has essentially, over the last 40 or 50 years, given that power to the executive to the point where the Congress has very, very little control. In this Congress, much to my shock and surprise and disappointment, we've effectively given away the power of the purse, which is one of the most powerful of the tools that the Congress has under our system, by allowing the president to essentially reprogram money without congressional approval. Congress says, okay, we set the budget and say, here's where it's spent. And the president decided he wanted to build his wall, which Congress didn't approve. And he took money out of the military construction fund to put into the wall, and Congress let him get away with it. Now, you can argue about the wall and this president, but that's a bad institutional precedent. And I raged about it in the Armed Services Committee, but members of his party just said, okay. And I think that's a precedent that we're going to worry about. But this really bothers me because our Constitution sets up this complicated set of checks and balances, and the Congress is slowly, gradually giving away its checks and balances. Okay, let me go on. Number 6, it really matters who's president. And I know that's pretty obvious. You're saying to yourself, well, good going, Angus. That means something. I mean, in other ways than simply the big ways that everybody is familiar with. And I remember saying this to Mary when Obama was president. I said, it really matters who's president because of things you don't think so much about. Who's going to be appointed to the FCC? Who are going to be the officials at the Department of Homeland Security? What is the EPA going to do with its research capability? All of these things that don't necessarily make headlines have enormous effects on Americans' daily lives. And so the decision of who the president is, which we're going to make in a couple of months, has a profound effect on the country in large ways, but also in many small ways. Number 7, there's no real debate in the U.S. Senate. The image of the U.S. Senate, I mean, in fact, the nickname is, as you probably have heard, the world's greatest deliberative body. There's very little true deliberation. When there's a vote, a contentious vote, we don't all go to the floor and debate and argue back and forth and then vote. The votes are pretty well cooked before you get there because you've talked to your caucus, you've talked to your colleagues, and you go in and vote. In fact, it's sort of weird. You go to the floor, and again, you can see this on C-SPAN. You go to the floor to make a speech, and you might make a great, passionate, effective speech, which I always do, of course, but there's nobody there to listen. The only person is the presiding officer, literally. There's nobody in the hall. And then you take your papers, you go back to your office, somebody else comes in, makes another powerful, effective speech, which nobody listens. Now, occasionally people are listening in their offices on C-SPAN and that kind of thing, but there's no real debate. It's very rare. Occasionally in committees, you'll have a good confrontation and debate and argument, but on the Senate floor, you don't. It's not like many legislative bodies where everybody's in their chairs for a certain period of time and you have real debate. That's been one of the things that's been surprising and disappointing to me. Number 8, there are islands of bipartisanship. One of them is a committee that I'm on, the Intelligence Committee. And it's a committee of only 15. And but it's very diverse. It's entirely bipartisan, but it's a diverse committee. We have Tom Cotton and John Cornyn, and we have Dianne Feinstein and Ron Wyden. I mean, and Kamala Harris. That's a pretty wide ideological spectrum, but we almost always act, if not unanimously, close to it. For example, we just released about a month ago, and it got sort of lost in all the news and the crush of the presidential campaign and COVID, but we released volume 5 of our really monumental report on the Russian engagement and interference in the 2016 election. And volume 5 was the one about the connections between the Trump campaign and the Russians. It's the one that I had the least confidence that we'd be able to do on a bipartisan basis. Lo and behold, it was reported out of the committee by a voice vote with 1 dissent. That is amazing, and it speaks to the fact that there can be bipartisan work, and there, as I say, there are islands, and our committee is one of them. Part of the reason for that is leadership. Mark Warner and Richard Burr, Richard stepped aside, and now Marco Rubio is the chair, but they've done a fabulous job of holding the committee together and going through some very difficult and contentious issues, but doing it in a nonpartisan way. And I've tried to do the same thing. In fact, a funny story, I feel part of my job on the committee, I'm like the catcher in the rye. I try to keep them herded in a direction in a bipartisan way. And early in the Russia investigation, Mark Warner and Richard Burr had a press conference that was talking about what we were doing, how we were going to do it. It was very good, and it was bipartisan, very strong. And I went over I saw Richard Burr outside of the Capitol one afternoon, and I said, Richard, great job in that press conference. It was just in the national interest. You guys were working together. That's what the country needs to see. And then I said, as they say in Hamilton, history has its eyes on you. Richard took a step back and said, Angus, I don't know if you want to quote Hamilton to me since my great-great-grandfather shot him. Now, I don't know. I don't think Richard Burr is really a direct descendant of Aaron Burr, but I think he's related in some way. But the point I want to make is there are places where it can work, and that's one of them. Number 9, we can sometimes get big things done. There's a feeling that nothing gets done because what you see in the papers and in the press is the conflict, the argument, the deadlock. But for example, about 6 weeks ago, we passed the largest conservation measure in 50 years, called the Great American Outdoors Act, and it fully funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and it funded for the first time the backlog of maintenance at our national parks. This was a big deal. It got 73 votes in the Senate, which is really amazing. Passed the House, the president signed it. This was a case where good things can get done, but generally there isn't much public attention. When something like that happens, it may be a one-day story, it may be on the 3rd page, but there are occasions when we can get things done, and we get a fair amount of smaller things done. It's the larger issues where there's the conflict and it becomes very difficult to get the work done. I think my final point is constituents matter. You matter. We do listen. I get between 3,000 and 4,000 emails and letters and calls a week, and that's from Maine. Imagine what it's like from New York or California or Pennsylvania. But it matters. I keep track of that. I get a report from my staff. I know what's coming in. And it's easy to say, well, the Senate is polarized. Why can't they work together? Well, one of the reasons is the country's polarized. The Senate reflects the country in that sense. And so there is this polarization for sure. But on the other hand, what I'm saying is what you think matters, what you communicate to me, to Susan Collins, to Shelley Pingree, Jared Golden, it does matter. And what we hear when we're back home, whether it's in a coffee shop or on the street, or if we are in coffee shops these days, but it really does matter. And I think you should realize that it's not blowing in the wind. I'll end with one quick story. You all know, and many of you participated in the PPP program under the CARES Act. And about, 2 or 3 months after that passed, I got an email from a guy in Portland, many of you know, who's a business person, who said there's some problems with this bill in terms of its flexibility, the timing, some of the limits, some of the deadlines. And he said, by the way, there's a bill in the House that seems to fix it. So I read his note. I talked to my colleagues in the House. We got in touch with them. We got a copy of the bill. I introduced the bill in the Senate. And lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, it passed. And it significantly assisted the administration of the PPP program for Maine businesses and businesses across the country. The point of the story is it all started with somebody in Maine being in touch with me, and that's the way the system's supposed to work. So I encourage you to keep in touch and to let us know, what you see happening and how we can do things better. So I'm sorry I've talked so fast, but I wanted to get through the list and be sure I had a chance to answer your questions. But I guess the final thing I would say is that I'm still sort of like a kid down here. It's such an overwhelming honor to be able to serve in this position. I still sort of have to pinch myself when I go in the Capitol. I still expect somebody to come up and say, you can't go there, but I'm a senator, I can. And it's an amazing experience. We can do better. I hope and believe that we will do better. It only works if it's a partnership between all of you and the people of Maine and me, and Susan and Shelley and Jared Golden. So I really appreciate the honor that you've given me to allow me to do this. I'm going to keep doing it as hard as I can, calling them as I see them, and try to do the right thing for Maine and the country. So thanks, and let's go to questions, Jim.
Senator, thank you so much. As always, we appreciate your insightful remarks, and in particular, in this time of great partisanship and divide, you have a capacity to step back and look at it in an academic way, which I and we really appreciate. So on that point, a question. Given all the partisanship and divide that we see in our institutions, that we see nationally, is there any hope? What can we do to move ourselves out of this?
Well, Jim, I'm a congenital optimist. I think there's always hope. And, you know, when you see things like the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, or the passage back in March of the original CARES Act, the original COVID bill, that passed the Senate unanimously, which was really amazing. I mean, it's hard to get unanimous agreement on what time it is down here. And to have gotten a unanimous vote, I told somebody it's pretty rare to have Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz vote the same way on the same bill. That indicates that it can happen. What happened in that case was bipartisan negotiations. And finally, after a couple of fits and starts, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and the White House sat down and made a deal. And we ended up with something that everybody could live with. That hasn't happened this time, to try to get to a second COVID bill. And I think that's a shame. For some reason, Mitch McConnell has decided either it's not very important, or he just doesn't want to attend. But I think there is hope, Jim. I think there are people. I can tell you there are a lot of sort of rank and file people like me who are saying, wait a minute, we really can do this better. And I got to tell you, there are a lot of good people here. I told Mary one day, I've never seen an outfit with more good people that gets less done. So I think there are some barriers to that, and hopefully we're going to keep chipping away at them.
Great, thank you. So along those lines, you also talked about some of the challenges that your committee sifted through over the 2016 election, the challenges we may face in the upcoming presidential election. I guess, what are your thoughts about the degree of interference for the upcoming election? Whether there are steps that are being taken that are effective? What should the average Mainer do to make sure that their vote is counted?
Well, I think to take the last part first, the best thing you can do is vote early, vote in person if you can, vote absentee, vote by mail, but just be sure and vote. I mean, that's essential this year, and I think everybody realizes that. We're better prepared than we were in 2016, Jim, but I don't think we're still there. For example, the Russians got into just about every state's voting system in 2016, into either the registration database or the sort of voting infrastructure. They didn't do anything. The intelligence is that no votes were changed, registration databases weren't manipulated. But what's bothered me, and I've said this on the Intelligence Committee, they weren't doing it for fun. And I'm worried that they could pull the trigger on that this time. And imagine the chaos that would ensue if 1 million people went to vote in South Florida and found their names removed from the registration list, for example. So I am very worried. The Russians are active. The Chinese and Iranians, to a lesser degree, not equal in any way, shape, or form to what the Russians are doing. And I have to say, I'm really irritated. You can imagine the phrase I might use other than irritated, that the Director of National Intelligence has announced that he's not going to brief Congress on Russian or on foreign interference in this election as required by law. That's an outrage. You The people are entitled to this information. You paid for it. The intelligence community works for you. They don't work for the president. They don't work for the National Security Council. They work for the American people. And if there's information that our intelligence community has regarding foreign interference in this election, the public should know it. That's one of the best defenses that we have, is if the public knows how their people are attempting to manipulate them, particularly from a foreign country. So that's something that's on the top of my mind right now, and we're trying to negotiate to get those briefings renewed. But I'm just I'm very frustrated by that, because I view it as an insult and as a lack of providing important information to the American people. So the answer is, we're better off than we were in 16, but we're not out of the woods, and we should be knowing what our government knows so we can defend ourselves.
Thank you. Well, it's difficult to pick up the newspaper, turn on the TV, and not hear about the fact that there is a presidential election this fall. Do you have any comments about that election that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, as I said I think it was point number 6, it really matters who's president. It matters in large ways and small. And I haven't made any formal endorsement in this campaign, but I think it's pretty clear that I'm disappointed in this president. I have to say, Jim, that of all the things that he's done that I disagree with, the one that I'm most worried about and most disappointed in is his amplifying and ramping up the idea that the election is rigged. The heart of the American experience is that elections decide who our leaders are and that we have a peaceful transfer of power. That's who America is. And when you have a president who is already saying, if I lose, it's rigged, that is an invitation to violence. It's an invitation to a lack of confidence and trust that will cripple our government. And it's every time he says something like that, it shocks me, because it's so antithetical to our system. In 1960, we had a very close presidential election. Richard Nixon could have contested, he could have argued, he could have gone to court, he could have done a lot of things. He conceded to John F. Kennedy because he said it would be harmful to the country to prolong the results of this election. Al Gore did the same thing in 2000. He had a case. He could have protested continued recounts, and he conceded, saying it would be harmful to the country. That's the spirit that should animate any candidate. And so, for the president to continue to talk about an election being rigged is profoundly dangerous and damaging to our democracy.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about the fact that the Senate, Congress is back in this fall. Thank you for being down in DC during this time. You mentioned a little bit about the likelihood that there might be another COVID-19 relief bill, and perhaps pessimistic about that. Should we write off any chances that there will not be a COVID-19 relief bill before the election, or is there a chance something could happen?
I think there is a chance. We went through a kind of kabuki dance last week where Mitch McConnell, as I mentioned, brought a bill to the floor that had not been to any committee, hadn't had any committee consideration, any debate. It came essentially out of his office, working with some of his colleagues, totally partisan, no discussion with the Democrats. He put it on the floor in a kind of take it or leave it style. The Democrats, and I voted with them, said no, because that's what happened. You got to remember what happened with the CARES Act. He did that then. He brought up a one-sided bill. The Democrats voted it down twice, and then he came to the table and negotiated what became, I think, a very good bill that helped a lot of people, helped keep the economy afloat. And the same thing happened this time, only he doesn't seem inclined to come back to the table and talk. There is some indications that perhaps the White House wants to talk. And I think if the White House wants to make a deal with with the Democrats. I think Mitch will go along with it. So I don't think it's 100% dead. I think of Monty Python. I'm not dead yet. You soon will be. Still dead. But I think there's some opportunity for discussions. I frankly think there is room for a compromise proposal. Jim, here's the sticking point. The major sticking point is aid to cities and municipalities. That's the Republicans. They're Republicans who say, I'm not going to vote for a dime of that. Well, that really bothers me because our states have the president, famously put all the responsibilities on the states, and they're getting hammered in their revenues and then also in additional expenditures. There was money in the CARES Act, but there's a lot more. The state of Maine is facing something like a $500 million shortfall over the next year or two. And ironically, Jim, here's what's ironic about this. All over the country, municipalities and states are having to cut jobs, many of which are first responders. And I said the other day, isn't it ironic that Mitch McConnell is the guy who's defunding the police? Literally, police officers are being laid off or being furloughed. They're not being hired. There are, and it also goes for firefighters, first responders, across the board. So that's the major sticking point, and that's where I think there has to be some give, or at least I hope there is, because it really is a desperate need in red states and blue states. This isn't a partisan issue. Kentucky, I heard the other day, has something like a $2 billion shortfall in their state government. So that's where we're stuck. And hopefully we can come to some compromise that will be helpful to states and municipalities. Remember, in Maine, a third of our budget goes right back to the municipalities in general purpose aid to education, revenue sharing. So when you talk about a hit to the state, you're really talking about a hit to the towns and cities of Maine. And we've just got to try to repair that. And I'm hopeful, I'll end by saying I'm hopeful that people are going to come together and say, yeah, there are some things we can do. It may not be what everybody wants, but it can make a difference to get us through this to the point where we can start to rebuild our economy.
Thank you. And I know that there are many businesses throughout Maine, governments throughout Maine that are anxiously awaiting, hoping that there is a relief bill. So thank you for your continued efforts to try to help get something to happen. Throughout the pandemic, Senator, you've been active in the Senate pushing for more measures to help Maine's tourism and hospitality industry, which is an industry that's been hit very hard by the pandemic. It's also something that's very, very important to Maine. Can you tell us more about any efforts you or others have been trying to move forward to help Maine's tourist economy and hospitality businesses?
Well, the PPP originally helped a lot of businesses, but unfortunately, it didn't fit sort of the way it was designed for many of our tourism businesses, because if they didn't have customers, they couldn't hold their staff, and the PPP was designed to encourage people to hold staff. So we shifted some of the percentages and the deadlines in order to be more helpful to those kinds of businesses. And from the feedback I'm getting, it has been helpful. We've got of course, we're pretty much through the season now. My understanding, and I've had Zoom calls with people in the industry and talked to people not only in Maine, but across the country in that industry. In Maine, it sort of got better as the summer went on. May and June were terrible. July was a little bit better. August wasn't bad. And I always, I talked to somebody who was in Bar Harbor the other day. They said, yeah, there were a lot of people, and the summer was not. The number I've heard is 60%, 50 or 60% of what a normal summer would have been. We've got to continue to try to rebuild that piece of our economy. It's the largest, as I recall. I haven't seen these numbers, but back when I was in Augusta, it was tourism was the largest employer in the state, over 100,000 people. Very important part of our state economy. We've just got to be building toward, hopefully, getting Saddleback reopened. Hopefully, we're going to have a winter sports in the state, snowmobiling and skiing. And let's keep our fingers crossed that by next spring, we're back to some semblance of normal and people are going to want to come to a beautiful place with a fantastic quality of life and wonderful people, and that's Maine.
Will we be seeing you at Sugarloaf this season?
Yeah, you sure will. I don't, nobody really quite knows what's going to happen, but I've already bought my season pass, so I'll be there. It keeps getting outdoors in the winter is what keeps you sane, I think.
Well, for many reasons, I hope to see you up there at the bag or the rack or on the slopes. Let's keep our fingers crossed. One other question that comes up, the fact that we're even having this conversation here today, and we have an international audience, telecommunications has become particularly important to helping us through. If we can't be together in person, we can be remote. But we have challenges to making sure there's enough infrastructure, both for broadband as well as for cellular communications. Any steps that need to be taken or should be taken to help improve connectivity for Mainers and others?
Jim, I think broadband in Maine is our #1 infrastructure issue. It's one of the most serious challenges that we have, and the pandemic has really underlined that. Kids who have been unable to connect with their classrooms in rural areas, people who could have worked from home but can't because they don't have a decent connection. We knew, this is something I've been working on ever since I came to the Senate, but the pandemic has really underlined how important this is. Telehealth for rural elderly people. It's issue after issue. I'm having a Zoom call, I can't remember whether it's today or tomorrow, with a group up in Washington County that's developed a community model for wiring their homes up there, and they've got a great service at a reasonable price. And so I'm looking for ideas, and in fact, I have a guy in Maine who works almost full-time on this issue. And I don't think there's any single solution. As you know, the people of Maine passed a bond issue last summer. I think it was $15 million for broadband. I'm working down here with the FCC and the various appropriations. I think it's something that ought to be in the next version of the CARES Act, because it's so important in terms of keeping people connected. So you're absolutely right. I think there's no higher priority in terms of infrastructure for Maine right now than dramatically improving broadband access and affordability. You can have the wire going by your house, but if you can't afford it, it doesn't help you much. So we need to be thinking about this the way Roosevelt thought of electricity in the 30s, when the utilities said, well, we can't afford to serve all those farms because the houses are too far apart. And Roosevelt created rural electrification, co-ops, and creative ways to get that service into every corner of America. We have to do exactly the same thing with broadband because it's an economic, social, and cultural necessity right now.
So speaking of electricity and energy, you spent much of your private business career in the energy area, renewable energy, energy conservation. Just this morning, I read about wildfires and glaciers leaving Antarctica, and without meaning to raise any partisan issues, it's an issue that people are talking about. Do you see that there's a need for more renewable energy? Is that the direction we should be going? If so, what steps should be taken to get there?
Well, I probably 2/3 of the people on this call, or maybe everybody on this call, knows Lori LaChance, wonderful president of Thomas College. Lori once said, when you get to a big problem, there's rarely a silver bullet, but there's often silver buckshot. And I love that image, which means there's no single solution. There are lots of things that we have to do. We have to develop energy storage. We have to develop a more reliable grid system. We have to allow people to make their own electricity, what's called distributed generation. We have to figure out carbon capture so that the fossil fuel plants don't put so much carbon into the atmosphere. We have to go to renewables, as you mentioned. That was a lot of the work that I did in the 80s and 90s. I think, Jim, the good news is there is a growing realization, even among those who have traditionally been opposed to climate legislation, that we've got to do something, that it's real. We formed about 6 months ago something called the Climate Solutions Caucus in the Senate. And it's 6 or 8 of us, bipartisan. That's important. Republicans are engaged in this issue. And I think that there's a growing political realization that this is no joke, and it isn't. I mean, all the data, you mentioned Antarctic ice sheet. I read recently about, I've been to Greenland. The Greenland ice sheet is melting. There's 20 feet of sea level rise just in the Greenland ice sheet. If the Greenland ice sheet disappears, ocean level goes up 20 feet. And, that would just be catastrophic. By the way, Antarctica is 200 feet. So we're really talking about practical, serious issues here. And it's not only, the Portland waterfront or the coast of Maine, it's, all of Florida, New Orleans, but it's also national security, Jim. It's this climate change is going to disrupt populations, and we're going to see migrations because of famine and drought. And that's going to be destabilizing on the whole world. So it's a major, probably the long-term most important issue that we face. And there's no single solution. As I mentioned, everything, I'm going to be in an hour talking about an energy storage bill that I'm working on. And we just got to do everything we can think of to try to deal with this issue. But it begins with public understanding, and it begins with all of us here in Washington getting it, that this is something we've got to deal with. I mean, the fires, you can't say climate change caused the fires in the West, but from what I've learned, it's so dry. They've had these historic droughts and heat, and the average temperature every month seems to be a record average temperature. So yes, this is something we have to attend to. And to me, the Climate Solutions Caucus, involving some very conservative Republican senators, is the best news I've heard on this subject in a long time.
Thank you. I think we probably have about 5 minutes left. So our next question is one that's near and dear to my heart as a former board member of the Portland Symphony, but a question about the arts, which is that the arts are essential to our human economy. And how can we better support music and theater business during this time of social distancing?
Well, you're right, and it's part of the culture and history and economy of Maine. I had a Zoom 2 days ago or late last week, I think it was on Friday, with representatives of the arts communities in Maine, and it's just been devastating. And the dollars that are involved, that these institutions inject into the economy, and a lot of them are in effect export businesses. They bring people into the state and bring dollars into the state, and they not only buy their concert tickets, but they buy dinner. They maybe spend the night at a motel or a hotel. So I'm sponsor of something called Save Our Stages Act, which is a bill that would provide support, grant support for community institutions that are cultural institutions. This is an easy issue for people to say, oh, well, that's a waste of money. But this is part of what makes our communities worth living in. And you're in Portland, Portland Stage, and everything from Portland Stage to the I think it's the Steep Falls Community Theater that Mary and I have gone to out in I think near in western Cumberland County. It's so important to who we are, and that should also be part of the COVID bill that we're trying to negotiate. Whether that will make it in, I don't know. I will share one story about mass gatherings. My friend Doug Jones, a wonderful senator from Alabama, had a new idea. He had a speech the other day at a drive-in theater in Alabama, where he had 200 or 300 cars in a drive-in theater. He was up on a stage. He made a speech. He said the only problem was nobody could applaud. They blinked their lights when they liked something that he said, which is sort of a weird thing. But we've got to get back to being together and being able to experience. A professor of mine once said, music is a Band-Aid for the soul. And right now, we need that kind of support, and it makes so much difference in people's lives.
Absolutely. Senator, thank you so much. I think we're up against the hour. I just want to say on behalf of the Chamber, our members, everyone in the community, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your hard work on behalf of Maine for so many years and for years to come. We really appreciate it. Really, now more than ever, we need the leadership that you're bringing. There was a good comment I wanted to share from our chat room, hoping that maybe you'll write a book or another book. This one would be called "Ribs, Beans, and Coleslaw: How to Fix the Senate."
There you go. All right. And listen, let's make a date to do this again in person, Jim.
We would love that. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. So again, a sincere thank you to Senator King for joining us this morning and for taking time to speak with us. And as we conclude, just a note about several upcoming events that we have. The Chamber recently launched, as I mentioned earlier, a 21-day racial equity challenge. If you have not already, there is still time to sign up. The challenge was designed to create dedicated time and space for each of us to build more effective social justice habits, particularly those dealing with issues of race, power, privilege, and leadership. An email will be sent to you every 21 days containing a short activity. You can complete these activities on your own time whenever it works best for you. Next Tuesday, on September 22nd, the Chamber is hosting a virtual panel on best practices to promote racial and social equity in the workplace. You will learn best practices on hiring, promoting, and retaining employees while working towards a diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace. And lastly, the Chamber is hosting, in partnership with the Racial Equity Institute, the Groundwater Approach, Building a Practical Understanding of Structural Racism, and that's Tuesday, September 29th. In this webinar, you will examine characteristics of modern-day racial inequality. To view a complete list of all of the Chamber's upcoming events, please visit our website or subscribe to the Chamber newsletter, and be sure to follow the Chamber across all social media platforms. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next month at Eggs and Issues in October. Be well and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.